We come now to the final lecture on the great principles of science. This has been an epic journey. We've surveyed all sorts of scientific principles, from atoms to stars, planets, and life. I want to end on a slightly different note. Rather than capping off with one more of the great discoveries of science, I want to explore some of the unanswered questions of science, the vast scientific frontier that remains unexplored. Yet there is a great principle of science here, and that is that no one can predict what we don't know, we don't know. In this lecture, I want to tell you about unanswered questions, the vast unexplored territory of science that's going to captivate science and science watchers, which I hope includes all of you now, for centuries to come. I'll illustrate the excitement of modern research by focusing on two amazing topics. The first, developmental biology, how life arises from a single cell, and then the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Is science really an endless frontier? Some of you may have read the shocking and sad news that today's scientists might be the last of a dying breed. Science, we are told, is nearing its twilight, the victim of its own success. There's an eager pack of science watchers, led by science journalist John Horgan, who would have us believe that the end of science is at hand. We are nearing a time, he says, when all the great laws of nature will have been deduced. Everything of significance that can be learned about the natural world will have been learned. The gist of Horgan's claim is this: there are only so many things to know in the universe, he says. Some of the great mysteries, such as the nature of consciousness, the ultimate structure of matter, the extent of the universe, these can never be solved by observational science, he claims. Scientists may engage in a fruitless pursuit of these problems, but their work's going to be more of an untestable philosophical speculation than science. As for the rest of what we don't know, each discovery brings us closer to closure. J.J. Thomson discovered the electron, so you can check that off the list. Evolution by natural selection, earthquakes by plate tectonics, nuclear reactions, electromagnetic radiation, DNA. Soon, we're going to know it all. It's rubbish. Such facile claims ignore the nature of the scientific process and the character of the questions that science attempts to answer. The trouble is that Horgan's well-publicized claims are more than just a harmless literary exercise. By casting doubt on the future vitality of science in stylish prose, he runs the risk of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. After all, why should the public support science? Why should they pay tax dollars for research if nothing of interest is left to discover? And of course, the end of science makes a great soundbite. William Harvey, who was the 17th century English physician who discovered the nature of the blood circulation, spoke for today's researchers and scientists when he said, quote, "All that we know is still infinitely less than all that remains unknown." The key to understanding why science is an endless frontier lies not in cataloging all the things we know, but rather in recognizing the vast amount of what remains unknown, the unanswered questions of science. There are countless profound, deep, fascinating questions that await scientists of this and of future generations. And I thought I'd conclude this series of lectures with a look at a couple of these great questions. I recently had the opportunity to conduct a survey of scientists for MIT's Technology Review, and I asked them to identify the biggest unanswered questions in their own fields. I was fascinated by the results. By far, the largest group placed questions about the mind at the top of their list. The mind, the brain, the nature of consciousness. Here we see a continuum of questions. Now, some of these, like what is a memory, are at the easier end of the questions and actually amenable to scientific research. But the question, what is consciousness, is probably right now beyond science. It's hard even to come up with an operational definition of consciousness, much less figure out a way to study it as a physical phenomenon. Now, physical scientists counted scientific mysteries about the nature of gravity at the top of their list. What is gravity? Where does it come from? What is the underlying physical principle that causes gravity to happen? They also were very interested in the nature of time. What is this strange dimension of time in which we experience one direction only, from the past to the future, never the other way? Where does time come from? How does it fit into the context of physical laws? And then there were the social sciences. Social science is something I've ignored in this lecture series, but it would be great to have a teaching company come up with the great principles of social science, because there are many important questions about the social sciences. The inevitability of war, for example. The rules of economics. The best way to raise a child. Most of their questions were steeped in moral and ethical considerations that are beyond the natural sciences and the scientific method. And then there are pressing questions related to human needs, increasing the food production, understanding Earth's global climate, curing disease. Let me look at just two of the great unanswered questions. And the first of these is developmental biology. One of the greatest mysteries of life is how the fertilized egg, a single cell, a microscopic object, can become a complete human being. How does this developmental process occur? From that single first cell, you get a wide variety of specialized structures composed of many different kinds of cells, hundreds of different kinds of cells in the human body. Every part of our body, every limb, every organ, every cell has its own astonishing developmental story to tell. As the first cell divided again and then again and again, primitive structures start to appear. The head, the gut, the legs, the heart. They take on their unique identities, while new generations of cells play specialized roles of blood and bone, of brain. How can this happen? Perhaps no other question in science could have a more complex or lengthy, complete answer. To document and describe the countless individual steps that yield a single fly, that is, the rough bristles of its legs, the regimented facets of its eyes, the tracery of its wings, it would require thousands of thick volumes, each richly illustrated, each dense in the jargon of genetics. If you're interested in this question, by the way, there is a wonderful book which gives you a sense of the field. It's called The Making of a Fly by Peter Lawrence. And even that introduction has incredible amounts of dense detail to just give you a feeling of how complicated this subject might be. For a human being, the volumes might number in the millions. And we are still a long way of knowing what goes in a book like that. Developmental biology is a peculiar sort of science. It's almost impossible to track the genetic pathways of development when everything goes right. Humans develop much too slowly, and the ethics of embryo research are much too touchy to make any sort of progress in studying our own species and how we develop. For this reason, developmental biologists hoping to learn how humans form when everything goes right concentrate their efforts on much more primitive, fast-breeding organisms in which something goes wrong. Developmental biologists, for example, subject flies to radiation or chemicals to make mutants. You get bizarre mutant flies with extra eyes or deformed wings. Sometimes they have legs sticking out of their heads where antennas should be. And these provide an intellectual goldmine for these researchers. They match the deformities with specific mutated genes. It's sort of like learning how a plane or an automobile works by trying to pull out different pieces and seeing when it crashes. The chemical signals that begin development start in the egg. For example, let's think about flatworms, which is one of the subjects of developmental biologists. Flatworms, the first egg cell division always results in a larger cell at one end of the egg and a smaller cell in the rear. Chemicals in the egg then control this orientation in the first cell division. But the egg can't control development forever. In the flatworm, after 2 cell divisions, that is a total of 4 cells, removal of any one of those cells results in grievous deformity to the flatworm. So evidently from that point on, the cells themselves send signals that guide development. The details of those signals, which may involve subtle interactions of many different chemicals, they're often obscure, but one principle has become clear. Each cell's role is determined by which of its genes turn on or turn off. Remember, every cell has all of the genes, Every cell in your body, for example, has every gene needed to make every part of your body. And yet cells take on specialized functions because one set of switches produces a nerve cell, another set generates muscle cells, another set generates skin cells, and so forth. We don't yet know what triggers those sets of genes. But every cell must be controlled by chemical signals. There has to be a unique chemical mix in a unique three-dimensional configuration. The details can be absolutely mind-numbing, involving literally thousands of genes in complexly intertwined arrays. To identify and understand all of these genes is just going to engage biologists for centuries. We may never know all the details of the developmental processes, the processes that sculpt our faces, that form our bodies, that give us our individual and unique minds. What we can hope to learn, though, perhaps even within a few decades, are some of the general principles that govern these developmental processes and also control the eventual death of all living things. In the process, I think we may be able to find new ways to heal broken and diseased bodies. Remember, every cell has the instructions to make any part of your body. So some days, patient may be able to regenerate their own damaged kidneys or their own damaged lungs from a single healthy cell. We may have victims of brain or spinal injuries that coaxed into producing new nerve cells and regenerating their nervous system. These instructions are buried deeply in all of us. We only need to learn how to read them. There was a recent breakthrough. Since I started giving this series of lectures, an important breakthrough in exactly this field. It was the discovery and the separation of human embryonic stem cells. These are cells from the earliest stage of an embryo. They're undifferentiated cells, cells that could become any part of your body. These cells hold out the prospect for curing many conditions from Parkinson's disease to spinal cord injury. And keep watching the news. Research on these cells is certainly going to be a very prominent part of developmental biology in the next few years. Well, let's turn to another very different unanswered question. Are we alone? This remains one of the most profound unanswered questions in science, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. This is called SETI. And by the way, it's also the subject of a new teaching company lecture series, which you might want to see in conjunction with this one on the principles of science. Prior to the late 1950s, before the launch of Sputnik, any quest for alien life was mocked as beyond the domain of serious science. It had nothing to do with scientific research. But that changed in 1959 when Giuseppe Cocconi and Philip Morrison, who are both physicists at Cornell University, transformed the scientific status of SETI because they proposed a simple and compelling experimental strategy for searching. Science requires reproducible observations and experiments. And until you have those experiments and the protocol for them, it's not scientific. But Cocconi and Morrison changed all that. They proposed looking for characteristic radio signals from nearby sun-like stars. They based their argument on the intriguing possibility that a scientifically advanced alien society might have established a radio signal beacon in the hopes of attracting our attention. In powerful prose, they concluded their first articles in follows. And let me give you this quote. "We therefore feel that a discriminating search for signals deserves a considerable effort. The probability of success is difficult to estimate, but if we never search, the chances of success are zero." Within 2 years, the National Academy of Sciences had organized a meeting of some of the world's leading astronomers to plot a strategy for SETI research. Now, are we alone is a question unlike most of those in science, most of the principles that I've talked about in this lecture series. See, most scientific questions are answered only gradually, and they require lengthy and inherently incomplete answers. But the search for intelligent technological life is different. The only possible answers are, yes, there is life, or we don't know. Until we discover an alien intelligence, we can never be certain of our solitude. A single, unambiguous communication or direct contact with another technological species is going to instantly answer the question and change forever our perception of life in the universe. Of course, the question also differs from most others in science in that it may be answered even if we never lift a finger. They may find us first. But I don't think we should count on that. Of course, once the alien life form is found, there are myriad new questions. Whole new areas of science are going to open up. We're going to try to find out about their distant origins, their novel biology, their technological capabilities, their ultimate intentions. And these ideas and others are going to consume scholars' lives for centuries to come. We don't know of any alien technological societies right now, but we can at least attempt to guess the probability of their existence. And this idea of estimating how many alien societies there might be was first proposed by SETI pioneer Frank Drake, who's a professor of astronomy at San Diego campus of the University of California. He suggested that there are 7 factors, each worthy of independent study and thought, and that each of these 7 factors contribute to the probability that an intelligent life form exists on other worlds. Let me go through these 7 points. It's fascinating to think about this process. His first question is pretty straightforward. How many sun-like stars are out there? Life as we know it cannot evolve and thrive without the energy of a sun-like star. Larger stars burn much too quickly. Smaller stars don't have enough energy. So you need a sun-like star. And Drake estimated that our galaxy holds perhaps 500 million possible suns. We can actually hope to answer this first question in the Drake equation by observations of the other stars around our galaxy. So that's a pretty straightforward question. Okay, the second question. How many sun-like stars have solar systems? In our present view of star formation, from a nebula of dust and gas, it seems like planetary systems are almost inevitable. Thus, the Milky Way galaxy could hold 500 million solar systems that are not unlike our own. Once again, we're probably going to be able to make direct observations of this, perhaps in 10 or 20 years when those new space interferometric telescopes are in place. We can actually look for Earth-like planetary systems around sun-like stars. Drake's third equation, or his third question, is how many solar systems have Earth-like planets? In other words, you can have a solar system, but is there a planet appropriate to forming life? The hallmark of Earth is abundant liquid water, which is stable in a relatively narrow range of temperatures between 0 and 100 degrees Celsius. Venus is too hot, it's too close to the sun. Mars is too cold, it's too far away. So it seems unlikely that any planetary system could boast more than 1 or perhaps 2 worlds with liquid water. Nevertheless, the number of Earth-like planets orbiting sun-like stars in our galaxy may be in the hundreds of millions. Again, direct observation in perhaps 20 years could answer that question. And then we come to a more philosophical question, one that's more difficult to answer. What fraction of Earth-like planets have life? Here, scientists are quite strongly divided. One articulate and persuasive group argues that life is a likely outcome of simple chemical reactions, as I've described to you. That chemical evolution is a standard, it's just a normal chemical process that occurs on virtually any planet that has water and appropriate carbon-based molecules available. But other scientists suspect that life is extremely rare, if not unique to our planet. One way we may be able to tell this is to look for direct observations of oxygen in the atmosphere of Earth-like planets. If we can actually detect oxygen, perhaps with telescopes in 20 or 30 years, then we may be able to say whether life is common on other worlds. It's also possible that laboratory experiments will produce life, and that would also give us strong indication. Well, these first 4 questions are quite answerable by current or projected scientific technologies. But now we come to much more speculation in the 5th, 6th, and 7th of the Drake questions. He asks, how often does life lead to intelligence? And here it's strictly a matter of opinion. Several kinds of animals, including whales and chimpanzees, octopi, display considerable learning ability. For example, you can put an octopus in one tank and have it learn to manipulate levers and arms to get food. An octopus in an adjacent tank can be watching its companion and learn just by watching what the first octopus has experimentally decided to do. That's intelligence. It may not be at the level of human intelligence, but it's still quite surprising. The thing is, if intelligence has evolved more than once on our own world, it might be reasonable to assume that intelligence is the kind of emergent property that occurs whenever multicellular life occurs. So maybe intelligence is common, but we just don't know yet. The sixth question, will intelligent life forms attempt to communicate with us? Well, intelligence guarantees neither the desire nor the ability to communicate across the vastness of space. If our planet had been entirely covered by oceans, for example, or if life had never ventured forth on land, there's no guarantee that any species could have developed radio. It's possible that there could be intelligent species that merely wish to communicate with themselves in a more of an art form rather than in a technological way. We just don't know. And the seventh and last of Drake's questions is the most speculative of all. How long do advanced societies remain communicative? And there are a couple possible reasons why a society that develops advanced communications might not do this for long. It's possible that radio communications become obsolete. They're replaced by some other technology, for example, fiber technologies, so that radio waves are no longer broadcast into space. It's possible that alien cultures, wary of extraterrestrial invaders, maintain strict radio silence. It's also very possible that advanced civilizations inevitably destroy themselves. Though they are little more than pure guesswork, estimates of half-lives of a society with radio technology, published by various scientists who really aren't using scientific methods in this case, they range from a pessimistic few decades to millions of years. Well, what's the solution to Drake's equation? By his most optimistic estimate, assuming that almost every Earth-like planet eventually develops intelligent life, Drake suggested that signals will originate from 1 in every 4 potential planets. That's perhaps 150 million planets in our galaxy alone. On the other hand, his most pessimistic calculation assumes that signals are broadcast from 1 in a million Earth-like planets. That's perhaps only 500 in the entire Milky Way galaxy. Astronomer Carl Sagan also played this game, and he favored an intermediate number of as many as 10 million technological communities. If that's true, then the chances are good that one of them lives within 100 light years of our solar system. Our radio waves were first broadcast commercially earlier in this century, and they may have already begun to bathe that distant planet. And our closest stellar neighbors may have already formulated a reply to them. The MIT scientist Philip Morrison refuses to speculate on the best estimate for the Drake equation. He gives the following quote. He says, "That isn't the right question." He says, "The question is really, should we do something to find out? To find out, you must do something empirical." And so the search, the active search, goes on. Radio waves and microwaves traveling at light speed through space provide the most practical medium for interstellar communication, while radio telescopes provide ideal receivers for these potential signals. SETI scientists suspect that the communications that we get from an intelligent species are going to be absolutely unambiguous. There's not going to be any question. Perhaps it's going to be a sequence representing prime numbers, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, 13, in a series of short pulses repeated over and over again to get our attention. Then they might send a binary message of coded dots and dashes that could convey basic information about the senders and about their home world. The central problem that confronts SETI scientists is where and how to search for such a signal. This is a huge problem. There are 3 different radio broadcast variables that you have to match. First, you have to find the direction to the source. You have to find the right place in the heavens to point your radio telescope. You have to have the frequency of that signal. And that frequency might be shifted slightly by red or blue shifts. So you have to adjust for that. And then you have to have your sensitivity correct. You have to see the intensity of that source above all the background noise. There's a staggering number of possible combinations. It makes the SETI effort something akin to searching for a needle in a cosmic haystack. There have been lots of efforts, and NASA began funding, but they discontinued its funding for SETI in the early 1990s. SETI research has then been carried on by other organizations, primarily sponsored by private groups, such as the Planetary Society. It's still a long shot, but think what it would mean to find an extraterrestrial intelligence. Think how that would change our perception of ourselves and the nature of the universe. I've come to the end of these lectures, but I want to leave you with one final great principle. You can think of this as a 61st principle, kind of a bonus principle. And that is that the frontier of science is endless. Even the most cursory view of today's most compelling scientific questions promises centuries of research, centuries of adventure and discovery, centuries of excitement that you and your children and their children can share. There's so much we don't know. Even after centuries of labor, by most estimates, we've only identified 1 or 2% of all the living species on Earth today. We've sampled only the thinnest outer skin of our planet. We've described only a few of the 80,000 or more proteins that our bodies produce. We now know all of the 100 or so stable elements of the periodic table, but the number of possible combinations of these elements is, for all intents and purposes, infinite. We have yet to answer mysteries like the dark matter question, the astonishing origin of life, the unimaginably complex development of you and me from a single cell. There are 1,000 other questions, both asked and as yet unasked. And we've observed only a tiny fraction of the billions and billions of galaxies that litter the cosmos, each of which has billions upon billions of stars with billions upon billions of planets. Many of those could have life as well. Even if a tiny fraction of other stars support life, then there are just countless billions of other living worlds out there waiting to be discovered. We are learning so much that we didn't know before. Even since I began giving this lecture series, there have been incredibly exciting discoveries in the news. Let me just tell you about a couple of these. They've discovered element 114. They've synthesized element 114, so the periodic table is now expanding beyond 112. They discovered that gamma ray bursts in the skies are now tied to individual visible places, brightening places in the universe. So they've now tied gamma ray bursts to visible spots for the first time. They've also discovered now that the universe at very, very large scales may be relatively homogeneous through studies of the distribution of galaxies. And these discoveries go on and on. You just have to keep looking at the newspapers week by week, and you'll be able to share in these discoveries. I want you to think for a moment about all the things that you and I don't know about the natural world. There are, of course, all sorts of things that we know we don't know about other worlds, about life's origins, and I've articulated some of those. But we can't even begin to imagine how much we don't know we don't know. Just 50 years ago, when Vannevar Bush described the endless frontier of science, no one had imagined lasers or buckyballs, transfer RNA, quasars, plate tectonics. The list goes on and on and on. And none of us can possibly foresee the discoveries of the next half century. Nor can we imagine the new questions that are going to drive scientists of future generations. The more our knowledge grows, the more we realize how much we don't know. We almost certainly have yet to ask and recognize many of the most profound questions that we could ask about the universe. The true measure of scientific progress is thus not so much a catalog of the questions that we can answer, as it is a list of the questions that we've learned to ask. And for as far ahead as anyone can foresee, there will be no end to those questions.